Hello, Heero here, and today we're gonna look at Cyrene, the romantic pink elf who shows her love and support for her fellow Crisis heirs through exclusive buffs that enable massive damage. I'll be discussing her kit, builds, Lightcones, and possible teams. Just as a quick disclaimer though, the footage and information shown is from the creator experience server, so some things could still change when her banner drops. Now let's first talk about her technique, just so we can get it out of the way. In the overworld, it summons an aura that increases your movement speed and freezes enemies that come in contact with it. And when you enter battle, it automatically activates her skills zone. But speaking of which, let's look at her skill, Bloom Elysium of Beyond, which does a couple of things. First of all, it gives 3 recollection every time you use it, making it one of the main methods to charge her ult. After which, it enables a zone that enables every ally to deal an instance of true damage equal to 24% of the original damage dealt by their attacks. It is also very important to note that once you use Cyrene's ult to summon her Memo Sprite and enter her enhanced state, you won't be able to use this ability again. Her basic attack also does give 1 stack of recollection, so if you mess up with SP management, at least you can still work towards her ult. But you always want to use her skill over this since building her ult is already slow enough as it is and you don't want to make it any slower, trust me. Now let's move on to her talent. First of all, it gives a 20% party-wide damage buff as long as she's on the field, which of course is pretty neat. But more importantly, at the start of combat or whenever Cyrene takes action, every single ally and their Memo Sprite gains the future buff. And when any ally with the future buff takes action with any ability like an ult, skill, or follow-up, they'll consume it to give Cyrene 1 stack of recollection. Now, Cyrene's ult requires 24 stacks of recollection to use it for the first time, which is insane. So thankfully, her passives are able to somewhat help with it. But speaking of which, her first passive gives her recollection points at the start of combat depending on the number of Crisis heirs or remembrance units in the team aside from Cyrene. This really emphasizes her need to be rounded Crisis heirs or remembrance units because having the 6 initial recollection points is essentially equal to 1 entire team rotation, or more specifically, 1 turn per unit including Cyrene, allowing her to get her ult significantly faster. As for her second passive, it's more of an indirect buff to help her stack generation. It basically wants you to build her with at least 180 speed to get her full 20% team-wide damage buff. And for every point of speed above 180, it will give her a 2% ice respen buff, but this only counts up to a max of 60 speed for a 120% respen buff. But you may be wondering, how does this help her with her stack generation? Well, it allows her to use her skill more often, but it also allows her to refresh future stacks faster. And since her ally stack generation is dependent on having future stacks, it results in her teammates being able to build her ult faster as well. And finally, her last ability automatically gives future to Memo Sprites when they're summoned while preventing them from ever consuming it. So essentially, they permanently have it. This makes Memo Sprites the best for charging Cyrene's ult, since they are not limited to waiting for Cyrene's turns to generate recollection. However, once you've reached 24 stacks, her ult becomes available while dispelling all debuffs on her. And aside from having a really pretty animation, it does a couple of things. First of all, it summons her Memo Sprite, which is just herself, and completely fills every ally's ults and lets her immediately apply her Memo Sprite skill buff to a unit, but more on that later. Then she enters her enhanced state, which increases her crit rate by 50%, permanently activates her skill zone, making her team-wide true damage permanent, and finally enhances her basic attack. It's worth noting that during this state, only her enhanced basic is usable during her turns, but the neat thing is, it becomes an AoE, gets stronger, and it now regens 3 recollection instead of 1. But sadly, it doesn't regen SP, so she's completely SP neutral in her enhanced state. Now, to save you the headache of having to decipher her Memo Sprite talent, it's basically just a lot of words just to state that Cyrene's Memo Sprite is herself, and she grants herself a 24% HP buff after her ult. Technically, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's all you really need to know in order to play her. Oh, and she also dispels all crowd control debuffs from all allies after being summoned, so basically after her first ult. But moving on, while in her enhanced state, the cost of her ult is lowered to 12 recollection points, and after casting it, you have the option to use one of her two Mema Sprite skills. The first is an AoE attack scaling off her Mema Sprite's HP, which is pretty useful for squeezing in a bit of extra damage in teams that don't really need Cyrene to reapply her Ode buffs. But speaking of which, the second Mema Sprite skill lets her apply Ode buffs to a single unit in the team. If the unit is a Crisis Heir, they gain a special buff unique to them, but if they're not, they only gain a 40% damage buff that also applies to their Mema Sprite. Now, there are 14 unique Ode buffs in total, one for each Crisis Heir, including Cyrene herself. So with that being said, let's look at each one of them and how they affect our beloved heirs and their teams. Now let's first start with Cyrene's personal Ode buff, which she does get for free for the entire battle after casting her first ult. First of all, after Cyrene gains recollection from each teammate, it enables her Minuet of Blooms, which is her offensive Mema Sprite skill, to deal an additional instance of HP scaling damage to one random enemy. And she also gains another buff mechanic, wherein she gains a stack of story when she summons her Mema Sprite and whenever she ults. And when you get 3 stacks of story, she gains an extra turn to automatically use her offensive Mema Sprite skill for free. Overall, it's just a fairly simple Ode buff that lets you squeeze in a bit more damage from Cyrene. But moving on to Cypher's Ode buff, which is a permanent buff that increases her damage dealt by 36%, while reducing the defense of the enemy with her Patron debuff by 20%, and the defense of other enemies by 12%. This damage buff isn't really too crazy, especially when considering a lot of her damage comes from other units due to her recording mechanic. But the defense shred is nice though, since it stacks nicely with the defense shreds from Resolution and her S1. Moving on to Tribby, her buff is also permanent, which enables her attacks to ignore 12% of the enemy defenses, and after she triggers her follow-up, it gains another instance of additional damage. This isn't really too crazy, it's just bonus damage for 3B. In terms of priority though, 3B should be one of the last units you consider to use Cyrene's Mema Sprite skill on. As for Ceri Salad, it's also another permanent buff, which increases the crit damage of the character with Ceredra's military merit by 30%, and after Coup de Main ends, Ceredra immediately gains 1 point of charge. I personally really like this buff, since it not only enables the units Ceredra supports to deal a bit more damage, it also allows you to get her double skill procs a bit more often. The only real issue with this is finding the opportunity to give Cyrene's buff to Ceredra, since the DPS Ceredra wants to be ran with wants Cyrene to use her Mema Sprite skill on them over and over again. Now for the RMC, they also gain a permanent buff which gives him an attack buff scaling off 16% of Cyrene's HP and a crit rate buff scaling off 72% of Cyrene's crit rate. All of this also applies to Mem Me Mem, of course. But aside from this, whenever the RMC uses their enhanced basic, Cyrene will automatically use her offensive Mema Sprite skill in conjunction. Overall, this makes the RMC very capable of dealing very good damage, especially in Evernight teams with the Mema Sprite buffs, and when combined with automatic skill procs for Cyrene, it's actually pretty surprising how much damage they can do together. Well, that's it for the supports. Now onto the sustains, the first of which is Hyacinth. She has 2 types of buffs. The first is when Cyrene uses her Mema Sprite skill on her, which has her gain 24 energy. But she also gains 2 stacks of Ode to Sky regardless of whoever Cyrene targets with her skill. 1 stack of this buff is consumed whenever Hyacinth heals to increase the amount of healing tallied by Little Ika. So it essentially just results in a bit more damage from the world weighing Pegasus. However, you'll most likely never want to use Cyrene's Mema Sprite skill on Hyacinth since she is fully capable of keeping good uptime on her ult. But now let's move on to Dan Heng. First of all, just like Hyacinth, he has 2 types of buffs. The first of which is if you use Cyrene's Mema Sprite skill on him, it gives Soul Dragon an instant turn, enhances it for this turn without consuming the counter for enhanced Soul Dragons, after which it gives a much bigger shield than a regular enhanced Soul Dragon. He also gains the Ode to Earth buff regardless of who Cyrene targets with her Mema Sprite skill. This gives his bondmate a 24% damage buff while enabling his next 3 Soul Dragon attacks to also deal additional damage scaling off the bondmate's current shield. Now, even if you never target him with Cyrene's Mema Sprite skill, you will always be able to take advantage of the free damage buff from his Ode to Earth buff just as long as you pair them together. So when comparing to Hyacinth, as a sustain, he'll be able to enable more damage while she enables faster recollection building. However, with all of them out of the way, we can now look at DPSs, starting with Hysolence because she is one of my favorite heirs. First of all, every time you use Cyrene's Memo Sprite skill in Hysolence, it gives her the Flowing Warm buff, which she can consume with any attack to gain 60 energy. But aside from this, she also gains a permanent 120% damage buff while also allowing her skill and basic to also detonate any DOT on the enemy. And this effect is permanent, by the way. Overall, this is a very insane buff. The damage buff allows Hysolence to deal massive damage, but the more important part is that it allows every part of Hysolence's kit to detonate DOTs, which allows her to be less reliant on Kafka. But when we look at teams, there are two variations you can run with Hysolence and Cyrene. The first of which is the standard DOT Kafka team, while the second is a full air team that relies solely on Hysolence's DOT detonations. At this point, we already know the deal with Kafka and her fast DOT detonations. But the neat thing is, Cyrene's damage buff for Hysolence also indirectly applies to Kafka's detonations, since their damage is calculated using Hysolence's DOTs that has the 120% damage buff from Cyrene. However, due to Cyrene enabling Hysolence to detonate DOTs, it opens up the possibility for a Kafka-less DOT team with the Crisis Air supports as a replacement. This team will be entirely focused on Hysolence's own damage and detonations, so it is very recommended you give Hysolence 160 speed to better compensate for the lack of Kafka. However, a really surprising team is one where you get to finally run Ceridra and Hysolence together, which has been the team that has been playing in the side video. Now, Ceridra's skill damage buff is useless for Hysolence, but you're mainly running her in this team for her attack buff and double skill procs to increase Hysolence's DOT detonation frequency. And surprisingly, I was able to achieve a 40k score in Pure Fiction with this team. Now you can also run other heirs as well, like the RMC, but they won't be able to produce the same results as Kafka or Ceridra due to the lower DOT detonation frequency. But there is one glaring issue with these teams, and that is that it has a long ramp-up time. The Kafka variation suffers from it taking longer to get Cyrene's ult due to being one air down, which isn't ideal since you'll most likely get her ult at the middle of the first cycle instead of at the end of the zeroth cycle. As to the full air version, it suffers from very low damage at the start of combat since Hysolence's detonations are locked behind Cyrene's ult. But moving on, let's look at Evernight, who also gets a permanent buff which increases the damage of Evi's detonations by 18%. And after Evernight uses a skill or ult, she gains one additional Memoria. And finally, the crit damage buff from her skill is further boosted by 12% of her own crit damage. Overall, it's a pretty simple but big damage buff for Evernight. Nothing really too much to say about it. But for teams, Cyrene is one of the best in slot units for an Evernight main DPS, since aside from her buffs, she's the last unit the team needed to completely be filled with remembrance units for Evernight's full buffs. So that goes without saying, the best variation of this team is one with the RMC and Hyacinth. It's also worth noting that this team has one of the fastest recollection generation rates, allowing you to get Cyrene's ult much earlier in combat. And it's also worth to mention that every single member of this team is capable of dealing insane amounts of damage due to Cyrene and Evernight's buffs. Now, I do consider Cyrene to be an upgrade over an E0 3B in this team. However, the gap gets closer when you have a 3B at E1, especially in AoE scenarios. However, when it comes to issues with this team, there is one, and that is if you have Hyacinth or not. You can't really use Donghong in this team, and there's no good replacements for Hyacinth that won't cause too much of a detriment. So if you don't have Hyacinth, you'll have to settle with Gallagher. But the main issue here is not only does it cost Cyrene to get her ult even slower, it also causes you to lose out on some buffs from Evernight. But moving on to Castoress, she also gets a permanent buff and an amazing one at that. It enables her new bud to overflow up to 200%. And when summoning Netherwing, it consumes all overflowed new bud to increase the damage multiplier of its detonation based on the number of overflow consumed. But if there are 2 or less enemies on the field, the bonus multiplier for each point of overflow increases further. Overall, it's just an insane buff that not only increases Castoress's damage, but also removes the worry of wasting new bud when healing or taking too much damage. Plus, it also allows you to save her ult for bigger damage instances if you wanted to. As for teams, Cyrene is one of the best supports to use on a caster's team, but the best variation is the one with Evernight and Hyacinth. But if you don't have Evernight, you can use the RMC or 3B, but just note it will cause recollection generation for Cyrene to become a tiny bit slower. Now there's not really too much to say, since everything I said about the Evernight team like the fast recollection building, getting full Evernight buffs, and more also applies to the Castor's team, so I'll refrain from restating all of them. But it does also include the issue with Hyacinth not really having a suitable replacement, and that E13B might be preferred over Cyrene in some AoE scenarios, so just take note of that. Now let's look at Mighty's Ode Buffs, which is applied every time Cyrene uses her Memo Spread skill on him. First of all, it removes all crowd control debuffs on him, but anyway, and if he's not in the Vendetta state, his action is advanced instantly. Of course, this debuff cleanse and action advance is pretty much useless for him since he'll enter the Vendetta way before getting Cyrene's ult anyway. And due to his passive, he'll most likely never leave it. But the more important part of Cyrene's buffs and what actually makes it pretty damn good is that it automatically triggers a free Godslayer Be God without consuming charge while increasing his crit damage by a whopping 200% for the attack. Which is insane for damage, especially if you time it back to back. And the neat part about this on-command Godslayer Be God is that it isn't subjected to his auto-battling. So you can save it to use whenever you want, giving you more agency over Mighty, which you previously didn't have. As for teams, Cyrene enables him to be ran with Ceridra as a support, allowing you to proc more double Godslayer Be Gods more often and more consistently, which was something only previously possible if you had this E2 or E6. This is of course on top of letting him take more advantage of Ceridra's skill damage buffs, but sadly her attack buff is still useless for him. So with that being said, his current best team is one with Ceridra and Hyacinth. However, if you don't have Ceridra, options like 3B and the RMC can work just fine. But sadly, just like Castorus and Evernight, you also have the issue of not having a suitable replacement for Hyacinth, which is an even worse issue here since the team doesn't have any Memo Sprites to help with recollection stacking for Cyrene. Though a small band-aid fix for this is just to run a sustainless Mighty with the RMC. But then support survivability becomes an issue and he gains less charge points, so take note of that. Which makes this team a bit harder to run in some content. But overall, once you get over the issue of not having Hyacinth, Cyrene's buffs for Mighty is just a very big upgrade for him, and it's all because of more Godslayer Be Gods. Now let's look at Aglaya. Every time you use Cyrene's Memo Spread skill on her, she gains the Romantic buff while maxing out Garment Maker's speed buff. Romantic can then be consumed after Aglaya or her Memo Sprite uses an attack to regen 70 energy. Plus Aglaya and Garment Maker also gets a 72% damage and 32% def ignore buff that lasts until the end of the Supreme Stance state, which can become permanent as long as you keep the state's uptime, but you'll have to reapply them with Cyrene's Memo Spread skill if Aglaya ever exits the state. The bonus energy Cyrene gives her is equal to the amount of energy Sundays and Ho-Ho's ult can give. Plus, Cyrene also has the instant ult refill after her first ult, so she can compensate for the fact that he can't use Ho-Ho in her teams anymore. But for teams, for an E0 Aglaya, it is still very recommended to also run Sunday due to her extremely high energy cost. However, this does mean getting Cyrene's ult becomes slower. But thankfully, due to Garment Maker's high speed and Sunday's action advances, you should be able to battery Cyrene enough to somewhat compensate for it and get her ult at the end of the 0th cycle, as seen in the video playing in the corner of the screen. However, if you want to get it a bit faster, running Hyacinth does also help, but you'll end up sacrificing the damage buff from Donghung's Ode buff to do so. Now, if you do have her E1, it does open up her team building by a tiny bit. And what I mean by that is now you can use supports like the RMC and Tribi instead of Sunday since energy isn't as tight with her E1. However, it's worth the note that this also makes the bonus energy from Cyrene's Ode buff less valuable for Aglaya. But hey, at least that damage buff is still pretty useful. Now moving on to Phynon, after her Memo Spread skill is used on him, he gains 6 Core Flames and the internal ignition buff. And when transforming, for each excess core flame above 12, he gains a 12% crit damage buff up to a 72% buff. Eternal Ignition gives him a 16% crit rate buff and makes his transformation permanent unless he somehow dies. This buff also causes him to consume 15% of his HP on attack, while causing any of his attacks to also deal 5 instances of additional damage. Now this buff does have quite a bit of anti-synergies and caveats tied to it. First of all, it causes you to never see your units again, which in my personal opinion is a bit sad. Leading to the second caveat, which is you won't be able to use your teammates' skills and ults probably for the entire battle. This isn't really ideal since you won't be able to get enhanced Soul Dragons from Dan Heng, extra coup de main charges from Cyrene's ult, the ability to apply Cyrene's other Ode Buffs to your supports or to have her deal damage, and more. Third, you'll lose out on a 50% attack buff since Phainon needs to transform twice in order to get his full 100% attack buff. Fourth, the Ode Buff's full 72% crit damage buff is locked behind E6 Phainon since it needs a total of 18 core flames to get, but pre-E6 can only stack up to 15 for a 32% crit damage buff. But it does introduce some form of confidence in a sense that you won't have to worry about your supports dying outside of its transformation. But for teams, the best one is with Ceridra and either Dan Heng or the RMC. But if you don't have Ceridra, you can use Trippy or the RMC. As a plus as well, you won't really have to worry about making a team centered around building Phainon's ult with Cyrene since you can instantly give him the core frames needed for it once you get her ult for the first time. But with that in mind, you can still technically use Sunday or Robin in this team since they can help generate recollection by advancing Cyrene. Just note for Robin, just make sure to use her ult directly after Cyrene's third turn to get another team rotation before the end of the 0th cycle. And with Sunday, make sure to only advance Cyrene after her third turn to avoid losing recollection points. Either the things I just mentioned should help in giving her a 4th turn in the 0th cycle to help with stack generation, given of course she has 180 speed with Von Whack or 200 speed. And the strat with Robin only works with Phainon since after her ult, her recollection stacking is terrible, so she ends up making it harder to get Cyrene's third ult onwards. But that doesn't matter in Phainon teams due to his permanent transformation. And finally, let's look at Anax's Ode Buffs. Every time you use Cyrene's Memo Sprite skill on him, it recovers 1 SP and allows him to immediately take action while increasing the number of skill damage instances he has by 3 for 1 turn. And the next time he uses a skill or basic, he gains the True Knowledge buff, which increases the attack and skill damage of all Erudition characters until his next turn. Overall, it's just a really great buff with no caveats. Makes SP management a bit comfier, provides an action advance to help compensate for the lack of Sunday and Bronya, all while improving his performance for both of his roles. Not only does it improve the damage of units like the Herta and a sub-DPS Anaxa team, it also massively improves Anaxa's personal damage through huge buffs and additional skill hits. Now as usual, you can use him as either a main or sub-DPS. For a main DPS Anaxa, his best team with Cyrene is one with Ceridra and Dan Heng for more damage or Hyacinth for faster recollection stacking. But if you don't have Ceridra, you can just use the RMC or 3B. But just like with Phainon, you can technically still use Sunday to give more turns for Anaxa to deal damage or to give Cyrene more turns to build recollection. You also just have the option of running a sustainless team as well with the RMC with either 3B or Ceridra if the content allows for it. As for a sub-DPS Anaxa, you can run him with the Herta for any content, but Jade and other Erudition units can also work for Pure Fiction. But a very important thing to note about this team is that it will suffer from the same issues as a Kafka Hysolence DOTT, in which getting Cyrene's ult becomes slower due to the lack of a 4th Crisis Heir, so as much as possible, it is really recommended you run Hyacinth instead of Dan Heng for this team, but he can still work, just expect a way slower ult from Cyrene. However, overall, I do believe Cyrene is one of Anaxa's best teammates, but it's really up to you if she's a must-pull for him since he already has a ton of great support options, so it's really dependent on who you have. But damn, that took long, but hey, at least now we can talk about her Eidolons. Her E1 enables the free offensive memo skill she gets from getting 3 stacks of story to give 6 recollection points, while increasing the bounce of this attack by 12, going from a total of 1 damage instance all the way to 13. In terms of ult gain, it's nothing too crazy, but it does allow her to get her third ult much faster, though sadly it doesn't benefit her initial ult building. But the increased number of damage instances does help in increasing her personal damage for all of her teams. As for her E2, when entering combat, she gains an additional 12 recollection points, and for each different ally that gets her Ode buff, her true damage multiplier increases by 6%, up to a max increase of 24%. However, what makes this Eidolon pretty good is that it lets her get to her first ult significantly faster, which leads to a couple of things. First of all, on a full team of heirs, it pretty much enables you to use her ult just a bit after her first turn, since she starts combat with 18 recollection stacks. This Eidolon also helps with a slow initial ramp up, resulting from you lacking some Crisis heirs to use in the team, which lets you use units like Gallagher, Silverwolf, Sunday, Bronya, and more in Cyrene teams as replacements with little to no drawback. Aside from this, it also makes it easier for you to use her in zero cycle clears with any of her teams, not just the Remembrance-centered ones. And it also allows you to use her with non-Crisis Air DPSs more effectively, since you won't be as reliant on having a full team of them to get her ult at the start of combat. And lastly, it allows you to use Ode Buffs of support Crisis Airs to support non-air DPSs. All of these points are of course really good and valid. However, there are notable counter-arguments for all of these you must consider before pulling for her E2. For the first one, it's possible to get her ult at the end of the 0th cycle even without this Eidolon with a full team of non-Memo Sprite heirs, which you'll see at the stat section or the timestamp on screen, and it's even faster than that for Remembrance teams. Meaning for a full air team, all you're really getting from this is a Cyrene ult at the start of the 0th cycle instead of at the end. Now it's up to you if that's really worth the cost of this Eidolon. For the second point, while yes, lacking airs causes you to get her ult slower, missing 1 or 2 still enables you to get her ult at around the middle of the first cycle for non-Remembrance teams. It's also worth noting that with the cost of this Eidolon, you could also just roll for the specific air you're missing, which I would argue is of better value since it opens up more team possibilities that are not exclusive to Cyrene. For the third point, not everyone really cares about zero cycling. You can get endgame Jade rewards just fine even without really doing so. But judging from the showcases my fellow content creators have posted, it is still possible to zero cycle with some of her teams even without her E2, but it's just gonna be a bit harder. And for the fourth and fifth points, there are better supports for non-Crisis Air DPSs. Remember, the other air supports like Cypher and Freebie alongside Sunday, Rob, and Bronya and others are more than capable of supporting units without Cyrene's Ode buffs. Now, I'm not disregarding the issues with their kit. I'm mainly stating all of this to help you see all of the aspects of this Eidolon so you can make an informed decision on if her E2 is worth it for you or not. Especially when considering the 4.x patches is on the horizon and we don't know how well the airs will perform then. As for her E4, for each time you use it, it increases the bounce damage multiplier for special offensive Memo Sprite skill triggered after getting 3 story stacks, which of course is just more Cyrene damage, plain and simple. And finally, her E6 allows her first ult to give all allies a 100% action advance. Aside from this, the story stack Memo Sprite skill gains different effects depending on the number of times you triggered it. On the first time, it gives all enemies a permanent def reduction, which is neat since you can get it after her second ult. And for the second use onwards, it just advances all allies' actions by 24%, which essentially is just a mini dance dance dance. With our Eidolons out of the way, let's talk about Lightcones. Cyrene's gorgeous signature increases her speed by 18%, and when the wearer's Memo Sprite uses a skill on the ally, they gain the Black buff, which increases every enemy's damage taken by 10%. And whenever they use a Memo Sprite skill on an enemy, they gain the Verse buff, which increases all allies' crit damage by 16%, and if both buffs are active on the Memo Sprite, its effects gets increased by 60%. Overall, it's just a simple option for increasing your team's damage output by a decent bit, while also helping Cyrene get enough speed to reach 180 or 200 speed in order to meet her passive requirements or aid in recollection building. However, unlike other Lightcones, aside from speed, it doesn't really provide anything too special that's needed for Cyrene to function, so it's just really more of a nice upgrade to have rather than a must-pull for her. This is especially the case when you consider the fact that she has a pretty decent free-to-play option in the form of the Herta Shop code. It gives a 12% speed buff to help her reach 180 or 200 speed, which is the main thing you're after with this Lightcone. Now sadly, Cyrene can't refresh its damage buff once you activate her ult, which does make her S1 a decent upgrade over it. It is also worth noting that if you have a Hyacine without her S1 or next page, she'll have to fight her for it. But speaking of Hyacine, her signature is also a very good option. It gives more speed than the Hertashop Cone, while also giving her access to its HP consumption mechanic, which is pretty great for Evernight teams. Just note, its damage vulnerability debuff needs a Memo Spread skill, so its uptime is entirely up to how fast you can get her ult in her enhanced state, or how often you can trigger her Ode's Memo Spread skill procs. But the RMC's Ode buff should be able to help with this. But if you have this Light Cone, you most likely have Hyacine as well, so I highly suggest just keeping it on her and using the Hertashop Cone on Cyrene instead. But if you happen to have an extra, it's not a bad option for Cyrene. And finally, you can also use Victory in a Blink to give a party-wide damage buff. But I would only really recommend it if you have nothing else, since the bonus speed from her other options is really important for her. But with her light cones out of the way, let's look at possible relics. A decent relic set is the Deliverer set, with it giving bonus crit rate and HP for Cyrene to help squeeze in a bit more damage from her Memo Sprite skill, while also providing a 15% damage buff to all allies until her next enhanced basic, which is neat for improving the team's damage. Cyrene should be able to keep full uptime of it during her enhanced state, plus it also stacks if you happen to have 2 of it in the team. However, its main downsides are it doesn't give speed, and that its buffs won't activate until you get her first ult and enhanced basic, which can probably take a while. So with that being said, in my opinion, the best option for her is a 2-piece speed combo. Like I said earlier, speed is very important for both her recollection stack generation and to get more ice rest pen for her damage. So this option helps her get to 180 or 200 speed much easier, while also enabling you to invest in more offensive stats like HP or crit. As for the planar set, if you're having trouble getting 200 speed, the best set is Von Whack, enabling her to get 3 turns in the 0th cycle even with just 180 speed, which is absolutely needed for her recollection generation. This is such a big band-aid fix for her slow ult generation that I would say it's her best in slot for most of her teams. However, if you've already reached 200 speed, you also have the option of using the new Amphoria set for crit rate and a party-wide 8% speed buff when her Memo Spread is up. But it's also very useful for Cyrene in a full Memo Spread castery steam, since it gives Hyacine more speed for more healing, resulting in more generated new bud. The only real issue is that you'll only get its speed buff after ulting. Lashaka can also be an option if you're running her with an attack scaling Crisis Air DPS like Anaxa, but sadly its energy regen is useless for her. And lastly, if you want to improve her personal damage, Demesne can work too. Just note, you'll have to reach 5k HP to get its effects, which shouldn't be too hard to do with her personal max HP buff. But again, I highly recommend just using Von Whack with 180 speed to reduce the hassle of fishing for good relics. With her possible sets out of the way, let's talk about stats. Looking at her stats and traces, she has a high base HP of 1397 and a low base speed of 101, which isn't too good since she wants a lot of speed. But with her traces giving her 9, it gets boosted to 110. Her traces also gives 37.3 crit damage and 10% HP, which is neat for her personal damage. But on top of this, she also has her 24% max HP buff and 50% crit rate buff. So make sure to consider all of that when building. For main stats, you want an HP or crit chest, speed boots, HP rope, and an ice or HP orb. For the orb and chest, just pick whichever one has the most speed, since it's much more important to reach her speed goals rather than getting more damage on her. For substat priority, you mainly want to focus on speed first, then HP and crit stats. Like I kept yapping about, getting to her speed goal is very important, getting other stats can come after. But for her stat goals, the first of course is 180 speed to get her passive team-wide damage buff. And it's also the go-to goal to get 3 turns in the 0th cycle with Von Whack. But in a similar vein, 200 speed achieves the same thing, which allows you to use another planar option on top of getting more ice rest pen for her personal damage. But the issue with it is that it's extremely hard to achieve, so I highly recommend just going for 180 speed Von Whack. As for HP and crit goals, Well, since her speed goals are pretty hard to get as is, just get as much as you can after meeting her speed goals. Just note, do not get over 50% crit rate since her enhanced state already gives her 50%. However, I cannot stress this enough, it is imperative you reach either of her speed goals. Not reaching them will make stack generation even more slower than it already is. Like I said in the kit section, apart from Memo Sprites, her team's stack generation is highly dependent on her getting her turns to refresh the future buff. So the faster she can get her turns, the faster her team and herself can generate recollection. For example, with a full air team without Memo Sprites, it's possible to get her ult at the 0th cycle with a 200 or 180 speed Von Wax setup. Just note, for units with 134 speed, you'll have to use their ults before Cyrene's third turn since their second turn will fall after her third turn. But for units with 143 plus speed, you'll have to use their ults after Cyrene's third turn since their second turn will fall before her third. And as a special note for 3B, since she's built with low speed, you have to use her ult before Cyrene's second turn because she only gets one turn in the 0th cycle. And here's an example video of the 0th cycle showing this strat in play with a non-Memo Sprite air team. As you can see, I began the battle with just 6 stacks, and after going through the entire cycle, I ended with 24, just enough to use her ult before the first cycle. But this is just the bare bones strat, and there are some things that can help improve it that should help you get her ult a tiny bit faster. First of all, of course, it's Memo Sprites. The more Memo Sprites you have in the team, the faster you can generate her stacks. And second is units with techniques that let them act in some way at the beginning of battle before Cyrene's first turn. This lets you take more advantage of the fact that Cyrene gives every ally the future buff at the start of combat. Now from testing, only 3 Chrysos heirs were able to do this, which are Don Hung, Ceridra, and surprisingly Cypher, either through her technique or proccing her follow-up with another unit's offensive technique. It's also worth noting that some Remembrance units can do something similar, since some of them have techniques that immediately summon Memo Sprites to act at the start of combat. And third, it's action advancers like Sunday. You can use him to advance Cyrene after her third turn to give her a 4th turn in the 0th cycle, and this should achieve similar results to as if you were running a full air team, allowing her to get her ult before the end of the 0th cycle. However, despite having 180 speed with Von Whack or 200 speed, not having a full air team will slow her recollection generation rate by a significant amount. So again, it's really recommended she is ran in a full air team, but sadly the slower ramp up is something you'll just have to live with in teams that require running a unit that isn't an air like a Kafka DOT team, or if you're missing some airs. But that's about it. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the pros and cons of the romantic pink elf Cyrene. Well, first of all, her being exclusively a Chrysos Air support is both a pro and a con. It's a pro in a sense that she enables some of them to perform much better, which can potentially increase their shelf life now that the 4.x patches are very near, meaning you can enjoy playing your favorite airs in endgame content much longer. And she can also act as an alternative support for any of your Chrysos Air DPSs if you don't have certain ones or simply want to use them in other teams. She can work with all Chrysos Air DPSs to varying degrees, but I digress. Remember, units like 3B, Sunday, Bronya, Cypher, Robin, and more are units that many comps want, so having an alternative to them for the air DPSs is always good. However, her being a dedicated support for the airs is also a curse in more ways than one. First of all, power creep in HSR is not kind. Once the DPS airs get pushed out in favor of new ones, she'll inevitably get pushed out as well. Other supports like 3B, Sunday, Cypher, Robin, and more just don't have this issue. Even if better versions of them come out, they'll still be usable even if it's just a weaker alternative, whereas Cyrene cannot. It's also very unlikely she gets a new Chrysos Air teammate, so her potential future value probably won't increase. Third, she causes team building to be super restrictive since you have to build a team around both a DPS and her need for Chrysos Airs. This causes issues like in the HP scaling air teams not having good replacements for Hyacine that doesn't have drawbacks. But that brings us to the third point, her long ramp-up time. Outside of Castorus and Evernight comps, even in a comp full of airs, her ult can still take a while to get, and missing an air in the team can make it even longer. However, this mainly becomes an issue for people who like zero cycling, since it makes it much harder to use her in zero cycle runs compared to other supports. As to the next con, a lot of her teams are expensive, especially the HP scaling ones. Now, this issue mainly stems from the fact that every air is a 5-star. Now, thankfully, we got both Dan Hong and the RMC for free, so it's a bit easier to make a team for her for attack scaling air DPSs. Which brings us to the next issue, which is the RMC is most likely to get a new path for the 4.x patches, meaning you get one less possible teammate for Cyrene, which makes team building even harder. And for the last con, her exclusive buffs aren't really equal for every Cressa's air, so her pull value will heavily depend on how many and which airs you have. So make sure to look at your roster carefully before pulling. Personally, as much as I like Eligio, I'm still on the fence about Cyrene due to the nature of her kit. But anyway, there won't be a showcase for Cyrene cause sadly this video is long enough already, but make sure to tell me what you think about her in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me with a like and a sub.